Now, Chapter 10 of Griffin's on Human Rights. Chapter 10, Welfare. So remember, we had our three basic, we're in part two, we have our three basic values that are sort of like the core values, the core human rights that surround and play a role in our normativity and have to be protected as human rights. The values of autonomy, liberty, and welfare. We talked about autonomy and liberty, split those up. Go back and check that out if you're not sure what those are. But here I want to talk about welfare, right? And kind of like the goods, the externalized goods that we have, and that we want, and that we think we have rights to. And what do we have rights to? Like, what should you get as part of like a rights claim? What do you have a right to? Um, well, welfare rights are nothing new, right? We might think of them as very new. You'd certainly think of them as really new if you read a lot of 19th century literature, because sometimes the attitudes towards the poor there are very much non-welfare rights attitudes. Like, for instance, when Dickens wants to make someone look horrible, he has them like a Mr. Pecksniff or something out of some of his novels, where they will act when someone who is poor, for instance, will ask them for something, and if they choose to give to the poor or the needy or whatever term you want, that's just simply an act of, that's just being kind, right? So it's never the case that, well, I'm really, really rich and you have nothing, I should give you something. No, 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 it's not like that. It's just, I'm really, really rich and you have nothing. And if I decide to give you something, that's just me being nice. That's like everything about welfare is like a favor, right? So when the poor people get something, they shouldn't say, well, I deserve that. No, they should just simply be grateful. That's a very strong, there's no such thing as a welfare right. So if you want to be in the camp of you don't believe at all in welfare, then you would say something like, well, if people are really fantastically wealthy and like they didn't steal it or whatever, but that poor people, there's nothing owed there, right? There's nothing owed. You can give it and be nice, but that's all it is. You're being nice. And then the proper response of people who get stuff would be gratitude, not that that my right was respected. No, no, no. I was just given a favor, so I got thrown that loaf of bread, or a crumb, and whatever I get, I should be grateful because they didn't have to do it. Okay, so that's a hardcore notion, and but that's fiction. But no doubt, a lot of people thought like that. But the idea of a right goes back to medieval origins, and I suspect if you kept looking, that this idea that those in need have a kind of right or a claim to those in surplus. So there were sort of, shall we say, theologically inspired arguments that, if we really thought about God's intentions, we're supposed to share the planet and we're supposed to share all the good stuff. So if by the fortunes and misfortunes and whatever of life on this world, God would expect you to share your goodies if you are in surplus. So if you have extra apples and winter's coming, you should hand some over to the other guy who's, let's say, his crop was devastated by worms or something, and you were lucky. So it was more or less an obligation to share in the goods of the earth, and had a theological type of underpinning. So that's old stuff. The idea of sharing, right? Which is, what really welfare is kind of about, is redistribution of goods, and as a moral obligation. Now, okay, but what kind of obligation is it, right? You can say, okay, maybe I'm obligated to share, oh, fine. But is that a human right? Now, remember, it could be a morally significant obligation, yeah, like maybe I do have lots of duties. Maybe I have a duty to be nice and respectful in the sense of saying hello in the morning or something like that. But am I discharging or respecting your human right by saying hello, even if I'm sort of being moral about it? Again, there's always this problem of something morally significant. Should it be a human right? And Griffin is always like trying to put the brakes on this. But here's where he doesn't respect the brakes, that some have tried to say that welfare rights are not a subset. That's what I mean by that little slash through that little horseshoe there. Are not a subset of human rights. Welfare rights are more like civil rights. Now you might say, okay, well, what does that mean? To make it easy, civil rights are really, you can think of it this way. You have civil rights because you have a claim on a community. So you might have a civil right to a driver's license, but that wouldn't be a human right because not every government is obligated. Here, I live in a region of the country of Canada, in Ontario, so I have a driver's license in Ontario. Maybe that's a civil right for me to have one. If I pass the exams and all that stuff and have a good driving record, I have a right to a driver's license issued by the Ontario government. But does everybody have that right? Well, no, it's a civil right. It's not a human right. Like, you know, and it might be tied to a deeper notion. Well, driving is not recognized as a human right. Because why? Well, because there's other ways to get around. I could take cabs, Ubers, and planes, trains, automobiles. You know, automobiles are just part of the possibility of moving around. So lots of governments, you know, and people think that really welfare rights are just, at best, they're civil rights. And there also would be, you know, the right to have a library card here in Ottawa. You have to live in Ottawa, something like that. So it's a civil right. Again, it's not a human right to have a library card to the Ottawa library system. Something like that. Okay, so Griffin wants to say, no, he wants to expand this. No, he wants to bring welfare rights as a subset. They are human rights. So welfare is part of this trinity, shall we say. Why? Because life in certain conditions are simply requisite to our being autonomous. And now, recall when Griffin has earlier talked about how to identify duty bearers for rights, you know, so people have rights. Well, if I have rights, then someone else has duties, or some institution has duties. And the notion of duty bearers was tied up with the ability to help. So remember, if I have a right to a certain thing like justice, if I have a right, maybe not to every form of justice, we'll look at that a little bit later, but if I have a right to, let's say, procedural justice, like due process, I have a right to due process. Who's the duty bearer of that right? If I have it, and Griffin would say, I have it even if there's no court system. Well, I just gave you the answer. It's a court system. There's a system that bears that duty of making sure that I have my right to due process is respected. So the ability to help plays a big role. And but that doesn't mean that ability per se is the only determinant of identifying a duty bearer when one has a human right. So there would be some kind of partiality would be allowed in certain cases and some not. So the state has to be impartial in discharging it as a duty bearer, right? It doesn't just say that, well, some people get due process and some don't. No, the state has to be impartial about that. But the state may have to be impartial about recognizing certain kinds of welfare rights and parceling out the goods. So in that sense, it's universal. So everyone has it, and the state has to provide it to everyone. So there might be universalized, at least within the context of a state. And what about others in the state? Let's say the ability to help, like he talks about very wealthy people. They would have an obligation as well. They could be a little bit more partial, right? So they might not have to be, like a very wealthy person might have an obligation to give to others, but they might not have the obligation to be impartial, so that they have to distribute, says Griffin, their money in the same way the state does, just right across the board. And that actually is a big fight in many ways about partiality when it comes to giving, because many people who are wealthy, they often say that they give a lot of money to society, right? And some do. I'm not saying no wealthy person does, and some do. But the question is, they can determine where they give all this money. Whereas if they paid a higher tax rate, some argue that, well, then it pushes it up into the impartial, so that money goes up into the state and is distributed impartially. So we do recognize this, that the ability to help breaks into different kinds, right? Impartial those who have a duty to help, but they must be impartial, and those who are allowed to be partial. You can argue about all the details of that. I just want to take, and it's an interesting topic, balancing freedom with one's resources and duty to pay in, and should one, be obligated to pay into an impartial system as opposed to keeping partiality. You can argue about that. The point that I just want to take away from this is Griffin's point, is that all have a duty to help. So, and that's nothing new. Like, you have a duty to give to charity, but it's an imperfect duty. Why? Because it's not really specified whom you have the duty to. You have the duty to charities in general, but no particular charity can say you have a duty to give to us and not that charity. No, you can be partial about to whom you give your charity money, but you cannot refuse to give it at all. But you can dole it out maybe in the ways that you want. So you can be partial on that. But still, you have an obligation. Griffin says, we can kind of universalize this. We all have welfare claims on each other. Paying into systems paying us back. If we're really heavily in surplus, those in need have right against. So wealthy people have obligations. A little bit, I couldn't help but thinking, that this is sort of like the ghost of Jacob Marley when he tells Ebenezer Scrooge, when Scrooge says, "You were just a good man of business," and Jacob Marley, the ghost of him says, "Mankind was my business." So that's sort of an argument that's going on here, is that even private wealth and all that, those who accumulate that have an obligation to pay into the system in some way, or at least to, that's a stronger claim, but to keep their partiality, but they still have to put money back into society in some way, maybe through philanthropy or whatever the case may be. But there is this universalization of welfare. Now, he says this explains some actions of governments. And as I said, there would be certain actions of governments that would be not universalizing welfare, and some yet would. And in this sense, governments exhibit a certain kind of partiality with respect to welfare as well. And simply put, if you go into a certain region, you're not from that area, and you go in and you fall sick, and the government would treat that government of that region would treat your right to a certain welfare right, namely to emergency medical treatment. If you stub your toe and let's say you need some medical treatment, but it's not, risking your life or whatever, but you just like, I don't know, I like a painkiller or something like that, that may not be treated free of charge. You might have to pay for that or something, or they may not treat that at all, right? So there would be some discrimination or partiality with respect to the need for medical attention. But if it's life or saving stuff, Griffin says, you're probably not going to be refused that. So there would be the actions of some states would regard like a welfare right as a universal. So even though you're not a member of that community, you could come in and get that benefit. So it would not be treated as a civil right. That welfare right would indeed be treated as and respected as a human right. Now, this universalization also starts to open up possibilities of as I talked about earlier, of governments getting involved in the affairs of other governments. So if what is the extension of this? So how far, when you start thinking about welfare as a human right, how far does that go? Right, because if I looked at medical treatment, the right to food. What if you have a state that can't or won't supply food? Right? Does another state have the right, maybe even obligation? The right to protect that document at the UN. You can have a look at that, where there are obligations. So intervention becomes so the right to intervene, maybe even an obligation, becomes part of the extension when you put welfare as a human right. So in that sense, it could license, states intervening in other states, let's say to alleviate suffering in some form. And Griffin had talked about this, where states, the right to intervention as a welfare right could overrun the sovereignty of another state and the autonomy of its own civilians. Because if, let's say, I'm the government and I got to, I say, hey, they're starving over there and I got to do something right away, I might suppress the democratic rights of my own people, says Griffin. Why? Because I don't have the time to hold a referendum. I got to do something about the starving over there. People are going to die before I can hold a referendum to see if it's okay. So I can suppress local kinds of rights in favor of universal welfare rights and suppress my recognition of sovereignty of another state. So Griffin says that yes, this could open up, and it's not a question mark. Yes, it could very well lead to that. So in some cases, these regarding welfare rights as human rights, and the whole notion of regarding a right as a human right means it's going to be universalizable. That would open up certain avenues where states would say they legitimately can interfere in the internal matters of other states. Now, we're not quite done yet with welfare rights. I'll come back to it in the next video.